Today, that is an important occasion since the publication in Italian of a very interesting and new book from the author, Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo. And the title of the book in English is Shrimp to Whale, and in Italian is obviously Da gambero a balena, which is actually the path that South Korea undertook to move from being a shrimp, poor, weak, forgotten shrimp, to a powerful and sometimes beautiful whale. We use the book as an excuse, as a good reason to talk about South Korea, an outstanding country that in few decades moved itself from a situation of backwardness to be one of the most industrialized countries in the world. We are going to explore this passage, this glorious passage, in analyzing three mainstays of the success of South Korea. The first one is the development of the society, which is actually the mainstay, the pillar of the book. How was that possible that a country often associated with poverty and backwardness, associated with the rice, with paddy fields, with agriculture, became so powerful, and everything became under the sun of democracy? We are used in Asia to highlight our attention to some social transformation which neglected democracy. China is the most important country we know about. China demonstrated that democracy, it's a tool, not a necessity for democracy. On the other side, South Korea proved that democracy is more than a tool. It's a prerequisite to grow economically. And that is important in a world where the temptation to avoid democracy in order to achieve economic results is gaining ground and ground. Also, associated with the economic development, South Korea proved to be good in other fields. The other two guests, in addition to Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, who actually, in addition to many activities he does, is also a teacher at the King's College in London. Professor Yunga Guak, among many other things, she's also a professor at the Louis University in Rome. She will tell us more about the relationship of the economic development with the cultural side. We know that South Korea is not only an industrialized country, is not only a democratic country, but also is a country providing a lot to the local and international culture. It seems easy to reconsider the last Nobel Prize for Literature given to a South Korean author, a lady, the Korean pop, or the masterpieces of the South Korean films gaining international acclaim. Finally, Professor Marco Milani from University of Bologna, a colleague, I used to teach at the University of Bologna many years back, will tell us more about the role of South Korea in foreign policy. Not an easy task. Pacific is a very troubling area in which some of the question marks originating from the World War II are not solved yet. The situation in the Korean Peninsula is one, the situation between China and Taiwan is two, and apparently they were not resolved but they were not able to forbid an economic achievement. Many, many things. I leave the floor to my colleagues. The timing will be a report from them, from the podium, and then the floor will be given to you for any possible question you might have. Ramon, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in Italy to present the Italian translation of the book that was published a couple of years ago in English and then in Italian last year, and other languages, Polish as well, I remember, for example, Turkish as well, and this year came out in Korean as well for the Korean audience. So what I'm going to do in these initial remarks, I'm going to summarize the core arguments of the book, then we're going to talk about culture and foreign policy, and then we'll have the Q&A. And I was here in the previous talk with the ambassador, and I saw the questions that you had for her, and a little bit scared about your questions, I have to say. Very interesting questions, but also very, very much to the point. So I look forward to it. Now, I come from Spain, as you can probably see from my long name and my accent. And the origin of the book goes back to my interest in South Korea, right? In Korea, which is the similar history between Spain and Korea. After the Second World War, both of us had a civil war. Both of us were poor countries, and both of us were dictatorships. Later on, both of us became rich, and we became democracies. And then our cultures became more globalized, even though today I would say that the Korean culture probably is better known than the Spanish culture outside of Europe. So very similar trajectories, hence my interest. I went to live in Korea 20 years ago when I was a student myself. And you probably know, Koreans are called the Italians of Asia, right? Because they're very passionate, very loud, if I may say so, especially compared to Japan, who are the British of Asia, so not very passionate and not very loud, right? But when I was there, coming from Spain and Italy being similar, as you probably know, I realized that there were many similarities in terms of not only the economic development, but also the society of the two countries, something that I found very interesting, the similarities that we have. And this was, as I said, 20 years ago, and even back then, I always wanted to write a book. I always wanted to know enough about South Korea to be able to write a book about the country that international audiences would like, but especially that Korean people would like, right? That Korean people would feel this is not someone projecting their own Western, Spanish, European view onto the country, but trying to analyze the country as not necessarily as a local would do, but understanding what the locals think about their own country. And this is what I did with the book. So in the book itself, we focus on the different aspects of the development and evolution of the country that you mentioned. A strong component of it, important component, obviously, is the economy of the country. I think these days we all know about Samsung, Hyundai. We all know about these companies. They were lesser known 20, 30 years ago. And if you look at these companies, they used to be the producers of cheap goods, similarly to what China has been doing until recently, or Vietnam is doing today. And then they went to the cutting edge of the technological frontier, right? If we look at semiconductors, if we look at green shipping, for example, if we look at AI, you have these Korean companies that are world leading, right? And how does this come about? So in the book, I look at both the big corporations of the country, the role of the government, but in the book, I really try to focus on the role of the people of the country as well. Because traditionally, when outside of Korea, we studied Korea's economic development, there was a big focus on the government and the big table, the big corporations that we all know about, and the people were somehow left aside, as if they didn't matter, right? So in the book, I combined the three of them, and I explained how the three of them were necessary for the country to become developed. And interestingly, this is something when discussing the book with policymakers and business people from places such as Southeast Asia, is an argument that they feel very close to what they are trying to achieve, right? Here in Europe, our economic development trajectory was very different because we have been rich, most European countries, for a very long period of time. There were some exceptions, of course, but most countries across the world, especially those that were colonized, like Korea, really didn't start to have their own independence and economic development until the 50s and the 60s. So we have seen this evolution as something I focus on the book as well. I focus on the societal development that you were rightly mentioning in your initial remarks. If you go back to the Korea of the 1940s, 1950s, so following colonization and following the Korean War, as you probably know, this was a society still very much influenced by Confucian principles, a society that even Koreans would say mentally hadn't evolved into where it is today, right? It was still set in the old forms that many Koreans feel didn't fit the country following the colonization from Japan and the Korean War. And that's something that I look in the book, how the mentality of the people of the country has actually changed to where we have today. So recently in Korea, it's very interesting when you talk to different generations, right? And this is idea that I'm borrowing from Koreans themselves. And they would say, well, Koreans in their 50s, in their 60s, or 60s, 70s, they still think of the country as a developing country. It is not a developed country. Maybe economically it's getting there, but it's still not the US, it's not Europe, it's not Japan, right? It is behind those countries. But socially, they also think we are behind these other countries, right? You talk to Koreans in the 40s, 30s, but especially those in their 40s, also going to the 50s, and they say, well, economically, we are developed, but we don't know for how long this will last. But they still remember when they were poor. I'm talking about real poverty, as you can imagine, right? So we are developed today, but in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, who knows? Maybe China will surpass us and we'll go back to being not at the cutting edge of technology and not being where we are today. You talk to Koreans in the 20s and the 30s, and some of you probably will have friends being in your 20s, right? Koreans this age. And it's very interesting because they say, we are developed. We are developed. We are simply different from other countries, right? We're not better and we are not worse. And this goes back to something I'm going to discuss briefly, right? Because sometimes the perception that we have here from Europe, that you get from the US, other places, I live in the UK, for example, in London, is that economically Korea has evolved, but socially maybe there's still a big backward, right? Maybe they're not at the same level as we are here in Europe when it comes to dealing with the integration of migrants, dealing with the role of women in society, right? But you talk to Koreans in the 20s and the 30s, never mind Koreans in their teams. Sometimes I give, I interact with Koreans who are still a school age. I say, well, you guys, you know, me coming from Spain, it's not that you are more developed than you are, it's that you developed in a different way, right? And I find this mentality very interesting because you have 3 generations of Koreans that think differently about how the country has evolved, not only economically, but also socially, right? And the societal aspect is something that I focus extensively in the book because I think this is something that maybe we discuss less compared to the economic development of the country and obviously the democratization process that took place in the 1980s. So why does this change take place? Well, what you start to see in Korea, until the 1980s, you may know this, when it was a dictatorship, it was very difficult for Koreans to travel overseas unless they wanted to migrate, right? Unless they went to Germany to get jobs, unless they went to the US to get jobs, right? It was very difficult. You couldn't have the freedom like we have here in Europe to get your passport and say, I'm going to travel to another country. I'm going to study in another country for 1 year, right? I saw before that here we have students from Turkey, from Nepal, right? From Central Asia, from many different places, something that Koreans couldn't do. From the 1990s, you start to see Koreans being able to go overseas, start to interact with nationals from overseas. You also start to see more foreigners moving into the country, not only American soldiers, but from other countries. And you see how Koreans, maintaining the roots, they also start to incorporate what they see in other countries that they think would be good for their own country, right? Things like, for example, Korea, you know, is more hierarchical as a society than we are here in Europe. But if you compare the hierarchies in Korea today, 2024, with the hierarchies that you had in the 1990s, this has completely changed. A very good friend of mine in Korea, Spanish actually, he's the director of one of the big hotel chains in Korea. And he says, you know, Koreans over 40, over 50, their life is their company, right? They are devoted to the company. Koreans under 40, not like that. They do their hours and that's it, right? And you cannot ask them to do extra hours. you cannot ask them to work when they are not due to work, right? So again, this different mentality. And this is something that Koreans have seen from other places and say, this is something good for us, right? So something that has become very common in the country. Koreans in their mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s, quitting their job, going away for a year. And then when they come back, they don't go back to the same company. They move somewhere else, or they launch their own company, right? Or they launch their own cafe, for example. So this change in mentality, I think, explains the evolution that you see in society in Korea today. And the very last point for these initial remarks, I also try to look in the book at what it means for the future of the country. Now, and in Korea, what you see something very interesting is that the liberal values that here in Europe we take for granted, not only politically, but socially, is something that maybe the older generations have not changed their views, right? Things like, for example, acceptance of homosexuality, for example, but the younger people have completely changed. So here what we saw in Europe is that society changed as a whole. In Korea, this hasn't happened. There's this big divide, actually, and you can see this in polls, in surveys, dozens of interviews that I made for the book, right? How you have different societies coexisting within the same country. Something that I find very interesting, and later on we can discuss if you are interested in this topic. But I don't want to take more than my assigned 10 minutes for initial remarks, and I'll let my fellow panelists go now. Thank you very much, and talk now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ramon. A few notes, just not to forget all the things I want to say. All right. Thank you very much to the organization for inviting me, and thank you to Professor Orlandi for the presentation, and to Professor Pacheco Pardo and Professor Kwak for being in the panel with me. So, as Professor Orlandi was saying, I will try to focus very quickly, briefly, 10 minutes, maybe I can do less, let's see, about foreign policy. And specifically, I would like to talk about the evolution of South Korean foreign policy. And I would like to start from the title of the book, because as it was pointed out, this book, which I have my own personal copy here, the title of the book is Shrimp to Whale. So, as everybody already pointed out, in the book, there are a lot of things about Korea: society, economics, political development, democratization. But if we go back to the title is about foreign policy. It's about how South Korea transformed, shifted from being a shrimp, so to be strongly influenced by great powers, and then it started to have its own agency in the international arena. A whale, we can talk about that. So I will put a question mark if it's really from a shrimp to a whale, but certainly it's not a shrimp anymore. So in order to analyze this evolution, I have a few minutes, so I have to skip a lot of important passages, but I would like to focus on 3 important points. Let's skip all the previous parts. So Korea has been influenced for many, many centuries by great powers around it. The idea of shrimp among whales is not something that came with the Cold War and the division of Korea. It's something that dates much earlier from that. Originally, Choson Korea was a tributary state of the Chinese Empire, so it was very close to China. So the first time that Korea found itself between 2 great powers was between the Chinese Empire and Japan. When Japan started to expand its influence and then started to conquer other territories in East Asia, Korea was one of the most important targets for Japan. So the first time that Korea was in between great powers was much earlier than the Cold War and the division of Korea. But still, we have China, we have Japan, and then in 1945, we have other two great powers that started to influence Korea. There are the United States and the USSR. The division of Korea is a byproduct of the Cold War balance of power. As you probably already know, so I'm not going to talk about this any longer, Korea was divided by the USA and the USSR, and the Korean people had no say in the division of the peninsula, okay? In fact, the Korean people didn't want, obviously, to divide the peninsula. August 15, 1945 was the day of liberation, not the day of division for Korea. So Korea has been for many, many centuries this kind of so-called shrimp among whales. That means that the shrimp, the small power, get affected, negatively affected by great powers when they fight with each other. And the latest byproduct of that is the division that still persists today. So the division that started during the Cold War is still in place today, 30 years after the Cold War ended. Okay, so the effects of this influence of great powers is going much longer than the end of the actual Cold War that started this thing. But as I said, Korea transitioned from this situation of being small powers negatively influenced by great powers, and started to become something much more important, up to the point that it is today, especially when we talk about foreign policy. And here, a crucial turning point that we have to focus on is the end of the 80s and the early 1990s, for two reasons. One, obviously, is the end of the Cold War. And we will talk a little bit about that in a minute. The other one is democratization. Korea became a democracy in 1987, 1988. So the transition was in 1987. The first free presidential elections were December 1987. And then in 1988, we have the full return to democracy. Obviously, also this point is debatable because for many people, the first president elected came from the previous military regime. So it was not like a full democratization, but still. Starting from 1988, what is interesting for foreign policy is that for the first time in South Korea, we have domestic political contestation about foreign policy. That means that before that, under the authoritarian regimes, we have 3 authoritarian regimes in South Korea from 1948 to 1987. During all these 40 years, within Korea, there was not a contestation in terms of foreign policy. That means that there was one line of foreign policy that was dictated by the regime, and there was no possibility of discussing different approaches to foreign policy, to national security strategies, as we have in all democracies, okay? As you can see today in many European countries or in the United States, the candidate for the American presidency, they have different ideas in foreign policy. So in Korea, starting from the 1990s, an important thing that we start to see is that foreign policy starts to become debated within the country. And that is another very important point that we have to focus on. But as I say, the end of the Cold War meant a lot of things for East Asia, a lot of things for Korea. But for South Korea specifically, it meant that it started to have a lot of possibilities to expand its foreign policy, to play a much bigger role in the region first and then at the global level. So we can say that starting from the early 1990s, we have a new country. South Korea we can see it as a little bit as a new country because it's fully democratized and is developed. On the other side, we have a new international environment, the post-Cold War world. And South Korea starts to become much more important, first in the region and then at the global level. And this leads us to our second point here that I also took from a very famous book by Scott Snyder. So we can call it Between Autonomy and Alliance, okay? I think that Scott Snyder chose autonomy because he liked the alliteration of words that start with A. I would say more dependency than alliance, okay? Because during the Cold War, South Korea was in a way dependent from the United States in terms of foreign policy, obviously. So starting from the end of the Cold War, and even more from the 2000s, from the late 1990s and the 2000s, South Korea started to have a more autonomous foreign policy from the United States. That doesn't mean that the United States are not important. That doesn't mean that the alliance with the United States is still the most important pillar of South Korean foreign policy. This is something that is shared both by the conservatives and the progressives in South Korea, the importance of the alliance with the United States. But we start to see a different way in which South Korea handles foreign policy in many different matters. Obviously, the one where we can see this division, this contestation more clearly is relations with North Korea. Relations with North Korea, inter-Korean relations between North and South, changes dramatically if we have a progressive government in South Korea or a conservative government in South Korea. And we can see that in a very recent examples. I'm sure you all remember what happened in 2018 between South and North Korea, and also between North Korea and the United States. So all the opening, all the diplomacy that was happening during that time in terms of inter-Korean relations. And the main reason is that we had at the time a progressive government in place in South Korea. So starting from the early 2000s, we can see there is more autonomy in South Korean foreign policy. And this autonomy is also dependent in some way from who is in power in South Korea. Because we don't have only the same party, authoritarian party in power as before, but we have two parties that compete in free elections and have different foreign policy platforms. In some issues, they agree. In other issues, they completely disagree. And inter-Korean relations is one of these key issues in which progressives and conservatives disagree on that. One of the points in which both parties agree, for example, is the fact that South Korea has to play a more active role at the global level. So we start to see from the late 2000s with the presidencies of President Kim Yong-bak, this idea of South Korea as a middle power, okay? I'm sure you heard a lot about the concept of middle powers, what middle powers are. So South Korea started to try to find a different way in terms of how to manage its foreign policy, not only in the region, but also at the global level. Try to be more active at the global level. And that's another very important point. And it would be interesting, maybe in the discussion, I would like to, I saved a lot of things that are happening today, because I'm sure that in the discussion we can talk about this. So we can also talk about the fact how South Korea is behaving today in terms of foreign policy and international relations. It's still a middle power. It's more aligned with the United States or not. So there are a lot of things that are happening today that comes directly from this evolution that I'm very quickly analyzing here. And that's the third point that I wanted to raise with you is the one that I already raised when I talked about contestation. Okay, I don't have a quote from a title of the book from that. Sorry, but it's the role of the domestic political divide, because in Korea today we have two parties that compete in free and fair elections, and who gets the presidency, which is the ultimate most important institutions in terms of foreign policy in Korea. Korea is a presidential system. Some people can call it semi-presidential, but it's more a presidential system. So the president is in charge of foreign policy. And who gets the presidency can change foreign policy of the country. And this domestic political divide, in my opinion, matters. I'm pretty sure that my friend Ramon can disagree a little bit on that, but we can talk about this. But still, there is a divide. Progressives and conservatives don't see things the same way. And the way in which Korea is behaving today in the international situation depends also on who is in power. And the fact that Korea, in the last couple of years, has decided to go in a specific way that we can discuss afterwards, it depends also on the fact that the current president, Yoon Suk-yeol, is a conservative president that has specific goals, specific idea on how to handle foreign policy and national security, okay? So these 3 points are very well analyzed and explained in the book by Ramon. Maybe the third one a little bit less because he doesn't agree with me on that, but that's okay. But still, we have to keep in mind these 3 important points if you want to understand contemporary South Korea, okay? So the evolution from shrimp, small power, to something bigger than that. There are a lot of metaphor from the animal world. People talked about a dolphin among whales or other animals, aquatic animals, okay? But certainly not a shrimp anymore. That's the first thing. The second thing, alliance with the United States, the most important part, but there is a degree of autonomy and agency by the Korean government today. And the third point is that domestic political contestation matters. Progressives and conservatives are not the same thing when it comes to foreign policy. I think I can stop here, and I hope you have a lot of good questions.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Young Kwak. I'm originally from South Korea. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the organizers, and then also, of course, 2 great speakers in front of me. So let me quickly start with my topics. Here, I was asked to talk about, Korean, the contemporary culture. Little bit about my background. I left Korea 27 years ago. Since then, I studied or study and work, or work in the 6 different foreign countries. So I actually never went back to Korea to live. So I always remaining outside of Korea so that I could see the development of South Korea from the other side. I remember that in 1997, the end early 2000, when I met some, foreign encountered, and then people ask, usual questions, get to know. So I was like, where are you from? I'm from Korea. The very first, some reaction was, where is that? So, now I see that how much has changed, like last about 25 years, nobody asked me where Korea is, where that's also coming from this book title nicely linked to. Then I always have to explain to them, China, the people usually say, yes. Japan, yes. We are in between there, between these 2 weak countries. So this is linked to Korean proverb, says that a shrimp between the whales. There was, the difficulties and the challenges where the Korean peninsula had faced since 50s. But of course, now we are in the different era. I teach in Louis University about Asian culture and politics and special focus on Korean peninsula. I also do teach in Sapienza about South Korea representation memories. Basically, I talk about contemporary Korean societies and its cultures, political system. So in this context, I really welcome your book because I still had a struggle to find the right reading for the students. It's not they are part of the Korean studies or program, but they're the students who is interested enough to spend their time to learn about Korea for a course for the 1 semester. So I needed a book who will explain, the changes from South Korea in 1950s, one of the agricultural poorer society into most high-tech, culturally, popular cultures, most well-received in the world in 2020s. So I thank you for this book. And I already told you this is going to be my reading list next year. I thank you about that. So then let me talk about the Korean popular culture. I think the already moderator mentioned about, this year's Nobel Prize in Literature. So Korean authors has been announced. So let's talk about how well Korean popular culture is received. Now, you heard about movie Parasite, right? Yes, this is the first, I have to emphasize, the first non-English language film to win the Best Picture at Oscar, right? And I believe that most of young people have watched Squid Games. Some may not, it may not your thing, but you heard about this thing, everybody was watching it, right? So this Squid Game is, probably you knew, if you watched it, this is a Korean dystopian survival thriller TV series and Netflix. It is the most popular TV series by hours. Watched the first 28 days on Netflix. It is still ranked as #1 on the list. The 1.65 billion hours being watched within first 48 hours. The first 28 days by 142 million households worldwide. So you could see that this, how this old Korean TV program became so popular. And then also not to mention that about Miss Han Gang, who just announced as Nobel Prize in Literature for this year. So before we talk about this, let me briefly talk about how this Korean wave has developed over there about 3 decades, I would say. So very first time, this Korean TV drama was sold to the neighboring countries. So in China and Japan, it became extreme hit in these societies. So that's why this concept we call Korean wave is also coming from the Chinese explanations. One of the Chinese, the newspaper wrote about, the Koreans' cultural products, they're coming as a wave to China. So at the very first, we call this a first generation of a Korean wave 1.0, starting from about mid-90s, let's say about 2010s, very much focused on the Korean TV. some films, and then a bit about the K-pops. But the majority of viewers were, let's say, the middle-aged people or above, who was more interesting to watch the TV dramas during their free times. This had changed about 2010s, more focus on K-pops. That the more younger generation get to interest about the Korean, the K-pops. Of course, there is still TV programs are there, movies are there, but its main focus is where all the Korean idols actually became famous in the world. By the way, is anybody who is members of army? Thanks for revealing your identity. I was one moment thinking, is nobody here? Yes. Those of you who does not know what I mean by army, these are the fan club name for BTS. This Korean, the idol group 방탄소년단, BTS. That's their fan group's names. They call them army. I don't know why, but they do that, right? So these are about Korean Wave 2.0 until 2015. Then now we call generation 3, we call K everything. So it's no longer Korean culture, the popular cultural products are just a wave, which is 감쟁것, but it can more established items in there next to you. So we call Korean Wave, including K-beauty, so K everything, including K-beauty, K fashions, K food. And so in academia, we try to really explain what this K stands for, right? It's like, is it really about the Koreans, Korean producers, or Korean people, or cultural aspect? But, there are these discussions. Let's leave it out to the scholars who will make it, the better work for that. So now we are living in this K everything time. I have to share with you the last week I was in Singapore. I came back yesterday, and then during this time, the weekend, I visited a small island called Batam, just in front of Singapore. I visited there. So I checked that there is about the, where to go eat the restaurant, and then I saw the Korean restaurants. And then one of these Korean restaurants claimed that they are halal certified Korean food. So now you can see is that now as a Korean food is well integrated locally, so that even Muslim countries, they have the treated the way they are serving the Korean food. So I see that it's very much the Korean, the cultural product is well received and it's very popular at this time of day. But do we know how long it will gonna take it? Professor Pacheco, did you actually mention that how long, this Korean wave or cultural products will be successful in your books?
Yeah, so yes, I was in Korea 2 days ago. So they asked me this same question, like, how long is this going to last? But when I was living in Korea first time, this was 2003, I was being asked the same question. So it's 20 years of asking the same question, how long is this going to last, right? So it might be it's going to last very long because we have been asking the same question, honestly, for 20 years, and it's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think when my daughter is older, I'm sure it will continue to be popular.
Yes. As a Korean, I would say we will enjoy while it lasts, the success of a Korean, the cultural product. Okay, I will end up my talk here. Thank you very much.
Now should be the time for a Q&A. Allow me to take a privilege as a moderator to have my first question. Professor, what is the exact relationship between culture and economic development? The reason for me to ask, being Italian myself, in the 16th century, Italy was the place with the highest per capita income in the world. An average Italian was the richest person in the world in the 16th century. At the same time, it was the time of the Renaissance in Italy with wonderful pieces of art. Second in place were the Netherlands with the golden century of Amsterdam, Delft, Den Haag, and so on. I think there is a strong relationship between economic development, which pushes the creativity, the artistic sense of a masterpiece. What is your opinion about it?
I agree. So how many of you believe in soft power? Do you believe in soft power yourselves? Many of you do, right? I didn't in soft power until I was proved wrong, right? So we're discussing this. Korea last year had record investment, right? So we're talking to a bunch of European business people. Why do you invest in Korea, right? It's not cheap. It's an expensive country to invest in. And they're saying, well, because if I tell my, if I tell my husband, if I tell my wife, we're moving to Korea because we're going to open a branch of my company, because we're going to open a research facility, it's easy to convince my family to move to Korea. 20 years ago, if you had told your partner, we're going to move to Korea, it's like, you go there, I'm not going, right? And this is culture. This is culture. When I lived there first time, 2003, Korea had around 2.5 million tourists per year, 2003, right? Last year the year before the pandemic, it had over 17 million. Now, by European standards, this is very low, but we see a huge increase. And this is not related, I mean, this is mainly related to the culture of the country. This summer, I mean, when any of us go to Korea, if you go there over the summer, you see all these foreign people wearing the hanbok, the traditional Korean dress, right? From Southeast Asia, from the Middle East, from South Asia, increasingly from Europe and from the US. And this is because they have watched a Korean drama. They want to wear the hanbok and take pictures in front of the palace. Simple as that, right? So I would say huge influence. And as I said, for a long time, I didn't believe in soft power. And I thought it's nice to talk about culture, and of course, cultural exports matter. But does this really mean that foreign business people will look at Korea? And then it happens that the answer is yes, right? So it matters hugely, as you were saying. I agree with you.
Thank you. I have a question for both of you. South Korea has been classified as a Confucian state. The teaching of Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, who promoted discipline, obedience, conservation, respect for the elders. This is something which not often is associated with creativity, individualism, whatever you put together to create culture. I got the feeling that at some point of its development, South Korea developed a major sense of individualism. It was said before, people over 50 years, they work 50 hours per week. Now, the younger generation, at 5 o'clock, they drop the pen or the keyboard, like we say. 6 o'clock, not 5 o'clock. Is it conceivable that a new wave of individualism has been developed to promote the art for which South Korea is known about today? Both of you.
Okay. Yes. I think that Yonga can answer this question much better than myself. But one thing that I want to highlight is that one key characteristic of the Korean wave is the concept of hybridity. So, and this is not something that you can see in pop culture. South Korean pop culture is widely considered as a hybrid product. That's why there is a big discussion about the K. What does this K of K-pop, K-drama, K-everything means? Because it is from the very beginning, all these products are from the very beginning hybrid products. That means that are influenced by different cultures. And they also have a very strong foundation in Korea and Korean culture, but they take a lot from other cultures. At the beginning, mostly from Japan and from the United States, but now increasingly from other cultures as well. So I think that this is not something that we can see only in culture, but also in society. So I think I agree with you with the fact that there is an increasingly hybridization also of the social structure. That doesn't mean that the previous heritage from Neo-Confucianism or all the things that we saw before doesn't exist anymore, but they are strongly influenced by other social structures, social characteristics that comes from other countries. And obviously they come from the history of South Korea, the strong influence of the United States, the proximity with Japan. So I think there is a degree of hybridization and hybridity also in the current social structure of South Korea. But I'm sure that Hong-ga can say much more than me about that.
I mean, we keep saying that everybody, we agree with you, you know, so if you, whatever you say. But yes, I do agree with you, this hybrid of the culture. But the point is that if we talk about these younger generations, whether they are, you know, like have a less influence of Confucianism in certain extent, some degree, they're more like have, you know, the Western influence, their attitude. But I don't think that's, you know, as you mentioned, they completely vanished. But for example, what you see, the TV dramas, which is, you know, quite successful outside. When you see the Squid Game, have you seen the movie Train to Busan, for example? So there is a very strong, the elements of Confucianism, families, togetherness, and group hierarchies also even in there. Because I remember one of these YouTuber, the American YouTubers, she was reading about the review, and she says that she was like really crying hard and watching the movie, this Train to Busan, and she says that I will never expect myself to will cry like this while I'm watching zombie movies. But Koreans be able to put the emotions and then social, you know, the society into these zombie movies. So when you see why the people are crying, because the love that cares about their children, and then the couples, and then the emotional involvement, but also, you know, the sacrifice, as you mentioned, that preservance of the Korean culture, there was all into this about, you know, less than 2 hours movie was in there. So certainly society is more moving to the westernized way, but still there is very strong elements about Koreanness that including Confucianism, you know, the collectivisms, and then also the families and emotions, etc. So it's still there. That's, I would say so.
You. Now it's your turn. Okay. Okay, you were the first. Oh, sorry. Second.
Thank you. My name is Andrei Chudikovsky, and I'm a global governance student. You mentioned Korean pop culture, such as Squid Game and Parasite. And Korean pop culture, I've seen, often focuses on the hyper-competitive and the money-centric and job-centric culture and environment of Korea. Do you think that this kind of culture and environment has positively or negatively impacted Korean society? And when I mean negatively, I meant the low birth rate that Korea is in a crisis right now.
Well, this is, thank you very much for these very sharp questions. Indeed, this also, you know, there is a very big problems also in the Korean society as well. This is not a country of utopia. So we, as you mentioned, that we're also suffering from extreme competitiveness already from, for example, the high school, even the middle schools. You know how many of the Korean children are spending their time at the after school, after this educations of, you know, after the school is finished, they're going to one after another after school to learn to become a super kids. Yes, this is a society that we are also going through. And then because of that, South Korea is suffering from, you know, the lowest birth rate at this moment. So the government tried to really bring the better solutions, but seems it will take a time to come. But I wouldn't say this was a negative or positive per se, but it's just social problems is in there. Maybe this is one of the dark side of the other side of the coin, where the country have reached rapid development. As you said, the 50s, one of the poorest country is now 2020s, the one of, the more world 10th economy in the world. This is maybe the Koreans are paying as a price. So the problem is there, but I wouldn't say that's also, it doesn't always have a negative side, but it's still, this can be played, also give the future plan for the, in the society. So it can be turned into the problem that we have solved. It's not like the Koreans are giving up, it's suddenly we have a problem, so we have to just, it's not like that. It's just in the part of daily life, it is in there, so the problems that we as a Korean is try to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always careful with this type of discussion, right? Because the point that you made is well taken about the birth rate, right? But now you see over the past 6 months, the birth rate is going up, right? So then the question is, why is it going up now, right? And you realize, not only in Korea, by the way, the same in Japan. Oh, are you okay? You okay? Yeah. Okay. If you look at Japan and Taiwan, which is very similar situation, right? Very few people have kids outside of if they're not married, right? In Korea, 95% of kids are in married couples, 5% non-married couple. Very different from Europe, where it's 50-50, right? So now what you see in Korea is the number of marriages going up, and as a result, the number of kids going up. Personally, I'm not surprised by that at all, right? To the point that if you look at the birth rate now, it has gone up above Taiwan, so it's not the lowest in the world anymore, and eventually we'll get to the same level that we have here in Europe, right? It will go to 1.1, 1.2. So what you do see though, and I think this is positive for the individual, maybe not for the group, talking about collectivism, is that more and more women in Korea can choose not to have kids or to have one kid if that's what they want. In the 1980s, if you were a woman, you had your kids and you quit your job, right? Now many women, and I include, I'm friends my age, I'm 43 now, so friends my age, if they want to have kids, they have kids. But if they want to have kids, I'm not going to have kids. I want to not enjoy my life. That's no way of putting it because I'm a father. I want to enjoy other things in life, not only having kids, right? And in the past, these women were forced to have kids. Now they are not, right? So I understand from an economic perspective and from a government perspective, you will see this as a problem. But from an individual perspective, they are doing what they want, right? And I find there's a very interesting change in mentality within the country that is making Koreans closer to what we already have here, right? When I talk to my students back at King's in the 20s, half of them want to have kids, half of them, because we discussed this in class, right? Half of them don't want to have kids, right? They may or may not have, right? But there's this change in mentality, and you see the same in Korea. But as I said, if you look at the birth rate, in 5 years' time, it should be around 1.1, 1.2, simply because more people are getting married, right? That's what's happening in Korea. But yeah, I mean, the competitiveness is there. I would go to the point that I was making before, right? Now 6 p.m. people leave their jobs. It goes back to the point about competitiveness. In the past, you couldn't leave your job at 6 p.m., right? Just stay there, as you know, you had to stay there until dinner, had drinks with your boss. Now the older people in the 40s, in the 50s, they complain because they say, oh, young people, they don't want to have drinks with me. They want to go to the gym. They want to go with their friends, right? And it goes back to this, I wouldn't say backlash against competitiveness, but people moving towards thinking more about themselves as opposed to what is good for the company, right? So there's this interesting change in the country, partially related to what you say. Younger people may not like the competitiveness that you were talking about, and they're moving away from it when they can.
Same story in Japan and China. Fertility rate drops. So the country must become rich before it gets old. Your question.
South Korea large conglomerates or chaebol like Samsung or Hyundai driving so much the country economic issues. However, the small enterprises struggle in comparison. What step can be taken to ensure a more equitable growth across all sectors, in particular regarding for small medium enterprises?
So I'm going to promote my next book because it focuses on this. So together with my colleague back at King's, we have a book in which we look at this entrepreneurship, small companies in Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and China, right? So I'm going to shorten very briefly answer the question with summarizing the argument, right? Which actually, yes, yesterday on the flight back, I was reading the proofs. So it's everything fresh in my mind. Basically, going back to the Asian financial crisis, was mentioned 1997-98, you have seen every single Korean government promoting small companies, startups, with very similar policies. They changed the name, of course, because they want to make it their own, but the same policies, right? Economic support to startups, but also how startups can work with the chaebol. Why this is the case? Because, and in Japan it's the same with the keiretsu actually. Why this is the case? Because the Korean government knows that the chaebol are going to be there. They're not going to disappear, right? And frankly speaking, no government, whether liberal or conservative, thinks that they should disappear. You may try to control how much they control different markets, right? The oligopolistic behavior, but they're not going to disappear. So you see this policy in which startups are encouraged to work with chaebol. For many startups and small companies, their founders, what they want to do actually is sell their company to a chaebol, and then they can retire, which is not a bad deal, right? There are those that want to compete, but if you want to compete, what we find in the book is that this is really sectors where the chaebol are not present. That's why you have something like a company such as Neighbor in the 1990s becoming the biggest internet portal because the chaebol were not there, right? You see this in the biotech sector, which most companies are not part of big chaebol. They're independent companies created from the 1990s, 2000s onwards, because there was a niche area there, right? And what I find interesting, and you can add to this, is in the last election, for the first time in Korean history since democratization, no candidate promised reform of the chaebol. Traditionally, as you know, all liberals or conservatives, they say, I'm going to reform the chaebol. This is going to change. Last election, because we're coming out of the pandemic, neither the conservative nor the liberal, right? Yoon Suk-yeol or Lee Jae-myung, they didn't mention the chaebol. They said, this works for the company, we have to recover from the pandemic. So in my view, what we're going to see is more of this. The chaebol will continue to be there, continue to encourage us. Korea is the only country in the world with a ministry for SMEs and startups, very interesting place to visit, whose job is to promote these companies, but without disrupting the structure of the economy of the country. And as I said, I don't see even the political will now to pretend. I think all politicians in Korea in the past pretended that they were going to reform the chaebol. I don't even see politicians pretending that they want to do that anymore.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I mean, I agree with everything that Ramon said. But I think that in terms of social and economic equality or inequality, the 1997-98 was a very big turning point because it changed the idea that you work for the same big corporation for the rest of your life. And that in a way also broke the social pact of hyper-competitivity. So you work a lot, you study a lot, and then you have a job for life that pays well and everything. So that changed with the financial crisis and the precarization of work. So I think that obviously chaebol are not going to disappear, and it's a good thing because they are the backbone of South Korean economic growth. But the government could do more in order to structure laws and norms in a way that can be things more equitable, even with chaebol in place. So we saw this year, for example, the first strikes at Samsung that did not really disrupt production and everything, but still symbolically is something, okay? So in a way, I think that also government can do something about that, especially right now that we are a little bit outside the idea of the neoliberal approach as the rule for everyone that works for everyone and it's the best possible way. So right now, I think something can be done a little bit more by the government in order to have more social and economic equality.
Any question?
Thank you. It was very interesting. My question is the last recent of World Bank stated that for now there is 100 states that are in the middle income trap. And what is interesting that many of them being in this trap for decades, like 40, 50 years. And meanwhile, Korea managed to leave this middle income countries group already in 90s. And I would like to ask what was the difference in the case of Korea, why the governing elites decided to provide these reforms. And yeah, basically that.
Yeah. Explain the magic recipe.
Oh, if I knew. I think something that you saw in Korea, and I talk this in the book, even when the country was poor and starting to develop, was an emphasis on innovation, because Korean policymakers and Korean chaebol, they knew that what they were doing back then, which was producing cheap textiles, later on cheap electronics, someone else would be able to do it in the future, right? As it has happened. Now China is doing that, and now we're seeing in Vietnam, Indonesia, India, other countries are producing these cheaper goods that Korea or Taiwan, for example, used to produce until the 1980s. So what I find interesting that already in the 1960s, when the country was really poor, this focus on let's have an educated workforce that will be able to produce innovative products. Let's focus on sectors in which we want to compete at the frontier stage in the future. So when you see the first Korean cars being exported in the 1970s, they were really bad cars, really bad cars. They were being laughed at, right? Because sometimes the door would fall down, right? So imagine that. But the focus was, okay, today they're laughing at us, but in the future, that's what we have to do. We have to produce cars, because if we keep on producing T-shirts and, you know, and textiles and shoes, someone is going to do it in the future, right? And I think that was key. Now, it's difficult to do because that means that you are going to lose jobs in sectors that provide a lot of employment, right? The textile sector, even today, is very labor intensive. Imagine the 60s and 70s when everything was being done by hand, right? So you knew that the people who had those jobs, at some point, they would lose those jobs, right? And that's difficult for a government and the companies themselves to decide to do. But in the case of Korea, they did, right? And the other thing that I would add to this is that the focus on exports, I think that was key. The fact that Korean companies were forced to compete overseas. I mean, you may not remember this, well, because you were not born then, right? But when Korea started to export mobile phones in the 1990s, early 2000s, they were not as good as European mobile phones. They were not as good as, do you know Alcatel? Probably you don't know Alcatel. Ericsson, Nokia. Nokia, you know, Ericsson? Okay, so in the 2000s, early 2000s, we all had Nokia mobile phones, right? Or Ericsson, if you were cool, you had Ericsson, right? Now, none of you has one of these mobile phones. You don't even know they made mobile phones probably, right? But back then, Korean mobile phones, they were not as good as these ones, but it was, okay, let's compete. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. For example, Korea, in my view, doesn't have a competitive biotech sector. But, you know, maybe in the future it will be. Same with mobile phones, same with cars. You know, green shipping, like most of green ships, which are non-polluting ships or less polluting ships, right? Ships, the ones that, because I always say ships, and because of my Spanish accent, I mean the ones that go on the water, not the ones that jump. Because no, sometimes people understand my accent, actually. Korea makes around 80% of these very high-tech ships, right? The cheaper ones are being made in China because Korea cannot do them, cannot produce them anymore, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, but I think the focus on innovation was key for Korea. And if you go to Korean universities and you see all these policymakers from Latin America, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, going to Korea to learn the secrets, so to speak, that's what they're looking at, right? How do you avoid the middle income trap? By looking at this institutional setting that allow Korea to do so.
No, I mean, you mentioned that, but just would like to emphasize about, you know, the educated workforce. The very first thing, when you see the Korean economic development, what the Korean parents did, the very first thing after they come out with the poverties. So until 1950s in South Korea, we had a shortage of food every year. And between, when the cultivation of the rice is finished, barley comes in March. So always January, February. So when you read Korean literature this time of period, people are suffering really from, the hunger because the food was in general in shortage. But the one thing is the emphasis that as soon as we came out from this poverty, the first thing what the Korean parents did was that the investment for children's educations. Instead of before they buy the house, before they buy the car, the first thing is they put the money for education so that they believe their children will have a better job in the future. I mean, South Korea is a small country. We have limited natural resources, but we depend on really human, this is our work, the well-educated workforce can cover creativity, so innovative thinkings. This is what we need. I mean, this is still the people who plays in the cultural product industries, entertainment, even in the old economic sectors. So the power of education will bring, as probably same reason why you are here, right? Same thing. So power of the education, believe them, will give them, create a better future, bring them better workforce, and then, society will develop with them together.
This is something that in Europe, we know already. That is the experience of Germany, at some extent of Italy. It is the export and investment-led growth. What do? You invest, you manufacture, low wages, low internal consumption. The majority of goods are exported. You export them, you get money, you reinvest the money, and the cycle goes on. What is the secret? Doing good things. Moving from T-shirts to shipyards. That was the major credit that South Korea, from an economic standpoint, can assume. Questions?
That's me.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Hello, nice to meet you. My name is Flamina Faure. I'm also a global governance student. I truly love Korean culture, and especially Korean food, but today I have a political question, unfortunately. So I wanted to ask, given the Conservative Party stance, do you believe a meaningful dialogue and a pacific resolution is realistically possible with North Korea? There are big complexity of engaging with a basically totalitarian regime, and especially with the ongoing missile threats and all the tensions. And so how can a non-democratic state like North Korea be approached for a sustainable peace? That's my question. Thank you, whoever wants to answer.
Yeah, that's a really, really tough question, actually. Look, we were discussing this in Seoul a couple of days ago. Look, if Trump wins the election, not that I want him to win the election, but if Trump wins the election and he sits down to talk to Kim Jong-un, June will follow because he doesn't want to be isolated. And his people, because I have some friends in his government, his people are very clear about this, right? If the US and North Korea are having a dialogue, we need to talk to South Korea. Whatever we think about the North Korean regime, we don't want to be isolated because Trump will talk to Kim Jong-un, and we know he's talking to Putin, and maybe he goes back to talking to Xi Jinping. And we know in Japan, the successive prime ministers have said they want to sit down with them. We cannot be isolated. So it goes back to the point that you were making about to what extent South Korea is autonomous on its foreign policy. When it comes to North Korea, the US matters hugely, right? Now, if Harris wins, I think we will assume she will follow the same policy, which is essentially neglect of North Korea. And then Jun has no incentive whatsoever to talk to North Korea. So I think we'd see 2.5 years of the same policy by the Jun government. But as I said, you talk to the Jun people, and that they're very clear. They really depend on the US on this one. Now the question is about, can you actually talk to North Korea? Now the point they make is that from their perspective, they may be right or wrong, but that's their perspective. North Korea is not opposed to dialogue. North Korea is opposed to dialogue based on the idea of denuclearization first, right? Which, if you were North Korea, I completely understand, right? Completely understand. But obviously, from the Jun government perspective, if you have to sit down with a nuclear North Korea, what can you do? If the US is talking to them, you have to do it, right? So for me, I find it interesting because so much depends on the elections in 2.5 weeks, I think, right? So you can ask again in 2.5 weeks, and we'll tell you yes or no, right? And as I said, the young people are very clear about this, that they won't go against the US if the US decides to pursue dialogue with North Korea.
Marco, vai.
I may add something. I agree with what Ramon said, but my opinion is that obviously the United States matter, but my take is that inter-Korean relations are not dependent only on the United States. So the fact that this current government has this kind of stance that is totally coherent with the conservative tradition in South Korea, in my opinion, nothing new. I mean, they present their policy as new every time, but it's never new. But if you tell them, they get super angry. Every time I try to talk with people close to the government in South Korea, and I tell them, oh, that this is exactly the same of Kim Yong-bak or Park Geun-hye. They say, no, absolutely different. It's the same. It makes sense, obviously. And in that way, it follows the United States. But why? The reason is that the conservatives value the alliance with the United States as the most important thing. So they can neglect inter-Korean relations in favor of following the American stance. So if Trump is elected and if he wants to talk to Kim Jong-un, then the young government has to do something about it. I don't see like that as a super, I mean, positive thing, because I don't think that Trump had a strategy on North Korea. He just wanted to, you know, make something new and a full opportunity or be recognized as something different. But I don't think he really had a different strategy about that. But still, the South Korean government has a role if he wants to have it in that, as the Moon Jae-in government demonstrated before. My opinion is that Yoon Suk-yeol has like a much more comprehensive strategy that includes North Korea. And the idea is that to promote South Korea as one of the key liberal democratic countries in the world that supports a liberal democratic order. So this narrative is perfectly in line with this policy towards North Korea. That is, human rights protection, is not a democratic country, but that's a political choice. You can talk to non-democratic countries, I can assure you. And you can talk to North Korea one way or another, but that's a deliberate political choice that is perfectly in line with the much more comprehensive strategy of the current government, I think.
Hello, thank you. I'm really happy to be here because I'm really interested in the Korean, in general, North and South traditional culture. So I will probably raise two questions. You can decide whether to answer the first one. One, it's politically, one, it's not. Maybe I shouldn't ask the first one, but considering what happened in North Korea with the meeting of Putin and Kim Jong-un recently, I mean, this happened. What do you think as a South Korean citizen of what their meeting actually understands for also your internal policy? And then the second question is more easy. Since you are Korea and they are Korea as well, you are South, they are North, how do you feel in your heart the main difference in terms of culture and freedom, always in terms of culture? Your large possibility to watch movies and blah, 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 and their non-possibility to do many things that you actually can do. So this is two questions.
Only apparently easier question.
I will answer the second questions about your second question. So how this South Korea is interferes to the North Korea. You see that there is also quite different generation gaps, you know, if we ask you this question. So because older generation, because still they are very old now, like, you know, these 80s above, they still have a family members in the North. So, you know, there's some people who relocated during the wartime. So for them, this North Korea is, you know, the family connections, the place to, you know, once it has to be get together. But now what I see is that more to the younger generation. For them, you know, this is a sort of a quite distance, the the place. And I must admit that as myself in Korean, probably I know least about North Korean society compared to other colleagues who is doing Korean studies and, the foreign colleagues. They have more freedom to visit the North Korea than myself. I don't think I will actually lined up to really visit to the North Korea, even if I have a chance, because still there is, I believe the other day I read in the newspaper article says that 6 Koreans still, the Korean Americans and so on, they're locked down in the North Korea as a prisoner. So my case, I can't really say much about North Korean society. But and also generation gap is quite different. Young people, maybe, the Koreans really thinking about North Korea every day in the daily life? We know them, we read them on the newspaper, and then the other day, it's like the North Koreans are sending this, the balloons with all the rubbish and poop in it. So then you see the North Koreans and the other side. We're busy with our daily life. But the point is that, because we are the 2 countries separated really long time now, it's 74 years now. So that, and then there is a political discussion about whether South Korea has to recognize this as a 2-state system or not. This is one of the hottest topic right now, especially between conservative and then the progressive political parties. So it's a lot of things that quite politicized than problem itself. So then how the one reflects, that's quite different positions. And then now, because also if you ask him sort of academic point of view, we saw that what happened in Germany. Germany's unification from the East and to the West. We see there's still the economic and political implication even now after 30 years. So the Koreans also recognize that, let's say the elite group is recognize that wouldn't be easy. Even the unification chance is coming. The realization of unification and the integration of a society, this is going to be really big challenges for South Korea, I believe.
Yeah, on your first question, because we're discussing this this week, I mean, huge worry, as you can imagine, among South Korean policymakers, because they reckon that this is the first time in history, probably, that Russia is more dependent on North Korea than vice versa, right? Because Russia needs to continue the war on Ukraine, therefore, and even today you may have seen the news, South Korean intelligence services have formally said, as well as Ukraine, and backed by the US, that they are North Korean soldiers or military advisors in Ukraine. So the question is, what is North Korea getting in return? And the South Koreans were talking to, they were saying that the price that Putin is paying is much more than he would be paying if there was no war, right? So technology, expertise, after the war, potentially military transfers from Russia when Russia starts to recover in the future to North Korea. So they think that even if the war were to finish today, right, Russia has to pay back North Korea. Therefore, for a few months, if not years, North Korea is going to receive all the support from Russia that without the war wouldn't be necessary. I mean, Marco, I remember you brought this group that you have in Bologna to Brussels in September, and we were discussing this, right? A group of young European experts on Korea. If you talk to anyone in Europe, this is the main worry that we have today about North Korea-Russia relations. But in South Korea, it has come top of the agenda, right? I agree with you that Jun didn't pay much attention to North Korea, but suddenly he has to worry because of all the support that North Korea is getting from Russia, right? So, and it has become top of the agenda. So huge worry and a worry for months, if not years to come, actually.
Last question.
Okay. I am Diego Del Valle, also from Global Governance. I wanted to ask, starting from also where Andre started about like pop culture, Parasite, Squid Game, but more of the economical side of the series, because the series reflected the film and the series reflected a highly not only competitive but ultra capitalistic society where that one top % controls everything and the last are forgotten and have to compete like for a prize sacrificing their lives. So it's pretty grim and depressing series. So I wanted to ask, like, economically, this richness of South Korea acquired recently how is distributed? Because there is people that say that Samsung has a huge role in the government, that is a bit of an oligarchic regime, not so democratic, where the companies control a lot of the democratic process. There are critics about how the money is distributed in a country like South Korea.
The question is so crucial. I would like to have all of you answer.
No, that's an interesting question. I mean, there are two aspects to it. The first one is that what I find interesting is that Korean cultural products that become popular, one of the reasons is because they reflect stories that we understand, right? I mean, there are many other Korean cultural products that are not popular here, right? So for example, Korea has a very strong science fiction film industry, but we don't know South Korean science fiction. We don't know South Korean comedies, which I really like, but those stories, I don't think we understand them very well. I say this because sometimes we consume Korean culture and include dramas, pop, movies, and we think, okay, this reflects Korea. But then if you watch these science fiction movies or comedies, you're like, okay, does this reflect Korea as well? So it's very interesting, right, to see what we find interesting here, like a Squid Game, right, or Parasite. We find it interesting because we understood, even I agree with you, there were many Korean elements, right? But we understood what the story was about, which is inequality, right? And other stories, we don't get them because they're very Korean. So now it gets me to the second point that I wanted to make, which is what I find interesting about Korea is if you look at wage inequality in Korea is quite low, but wealth inequality is quite high, right? And that touches on the point that you make, right? When it comes to wealth, there are, I wouldn't say a small number of families because I've seen so many different calculations, but there is a smallish group of families, companies that control a lot of the wealth of the country. Even if when it comes to wages, they're not major. And actually, wage inequality in South Korea, interestingly, has been going down over the past 3 or 4 years, going back to the Moon government that implemented certain policies to reduce this type of inequality, whereas wealth inequality has been going up. Now, the issue here is that if you look at wealth inequality in South Korea, it has come in tandem with the internationalization of the economy, right? So as this Korean chaebol have become more international, those that are lucky enough to own those chaebol, marry into those chaebol, or other companies, they have benefited hugely because this is not only Korean wealth, this is international wealth now that they're getting access to. So I find it extremely difficult to solve. If it was easy to solve, it would have been solved, right? But I don't see that happening. And the other point that I find interesting about your question is that personally, I like the way that Koreans are able to reflect this in movies and dramas and all. I think it's good that they can tackle those topics. And I think it's good that there is no self-censorship. And what I find very interesting is that many of these movies are actually funded by the chaebol. If you know the Korean film industry and drama industry, this is the chaebol funding these movies that talk about inequality in Korea or suicide or all these societal ills that the country has, right? So there's this paradox as well that the chaebol, they're actually economically benefiting from these artists, reflecting the problems that the country have that are partly related to the behavior of this chaebol, right? So it's very paradoxical in my view, because you don't see this in many other countries, right? Big companies funding movies, they talk about why big companies are not good for the country.
Yeah, if I may add a couple of things. I completely agree with what Ramon said about how we consume Korean pop culture, not we in Italy, but in general, in an international audience, a global audience. And that goes back to the idea that international networks, especially like OTT platforms like Netflix and things like that, they invest to make money. So when they see that there is an opening, they go directly there. And what I mean is that social inequality has been represented in movies and TV, mostly movies, but also in TV dramas for 20 years. Bong Joon-ho represented a lot of these things in his previous movies before Parasite. But then with Parasite, that opened something like a genre about Korean dystopian social inequality. It's like with the Asia Extreme in the 2000s, okay, with The Ring and other movies, that all the movies that came from East Asia were extreme, okay, horror movies or things like that. Obviously, like 1% of the production, but that is how it is like advertised and promoted to the international audience. So I completely agree. Squid Game, Parasite are very important blockbuster products, but there is so much more to that is not about social inequality. And the other thing about more specifically social inequality, I think that inequality went up after the crisis. If you see the Gini index, it went up. It's still much lower than most Western countries, but it went up, and it stayed up for a little bit higher for many, many years until a few years ago. But the big thing is about wealth and about social mobility. So it's not a lot about social inequality, it's about social mobility. So the fact that if you're born in a rich family, you're going to have a good life. If you're born in a poor family, you're not going to have a good life. The so-called golden spoon theory. So if you haven't heard about that, there are a couple of very interesting articles about that. One went out on the Journal of Asian Studies a few years ago, very interesting. So I think the big problem, and mostly for younger generations, is not social inequality, that is a thing, is social mobility. So how can people, through hard work, get to a better position in terms of social position and economic gains? I think that is more problematic than redistribute the wealth or increase wages. But it's how to restore the social mobility that was very strong in Korea during the years before 1997 and during the big economic growth of the country.
Yeah, I agree with everything else both of you have said. As I mentioned at the beginning, I left Korea. I lived in Italy is my number 6 foreign country to live. This life in the 27 years in most of the Western countries like Switzerland, the Netherlands, the US, UK, Germany, now in Italy. The social inequality in the real life, what I see from Korea is, I don't say that Korea is so extremely worse than what I see from these European countries. But what you see on the TV, on the movies and TV dramas, it has been sort of exaggerated because they have to make stories to get interest. The human emotions are there. So that's the one point. And the other thing is that as Marco mentioned, that what we worry about in the Korean society in the past, let's say when I was a younger generation, I have a chance to, if my parents put my educations, I can get better education, I have a better chance to get a better job. I can sort of climb the class from, let's say, from, this low, like middle class, or there is a chance I can change my life. But this younger generation these days, we have less and less, more closer door in this change in the social class. I think that would be the one of the concern the Korean society has to sort of sort it out for the futures. But yeah, thank you.
We reached the end. Many things we span throughout many topics, rising the complexity of the situation, rising the level of our doubts. I thank you, my colleagues, Ramon, Guha, Marco. Thank you all. Thanks the organizer. See you next time, and thank you for your time.
Excuse me, we start again at 4:30, okay? Thank you.